So I don't think, Doris Duke was the sweet person that everybody kind of thought she was. I think she definitely had, different sides to her. But so he goes in and he turns in his resignation, and there's just a big fight. And this all comes out, years later when the only witness actually came forward. The only witness at the time was the paper boy, who was 13. But what the paper boy says is he was down the road and he heard a bunch of screaming and fighting, and then he heard a bunch of screeching, and then a big crash, and then more, car screeching.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen. Here's Attorney-CPA, Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This week we want to look at the person, the fortune's fate of Doris Duke. Now, how many know the name Doris Duke? I bet many of you do. You think of Duke University. You think of, many of you, tobacco, if you're from the Southeast. I'll talk in a few minutes about that. But we think that when Marlea was doing her research for this, while she did see that there had been quite a bit written about Doris Duke, really no one has spent much time talking about lessons in terms of her estate planning, in terms of her planning, because it magnifies beyond simply talking about the estate. So we wanted to approach it more from that perspective, though in order to do that, we've got to spend a significant amount of time talking about her and the fortune left her and the way in which she handled that. So it is a very interesting story. Those of you who think that you know something about Doris Duke, and I'm sure you do, I think you'll learn some things in this episode we have today. We're going to try to keep this to 30 minutes or so. Sometimes we spill over. I apologize for that. I know that many of you prefer short than long. So we're going to try to stay on a 30-minute budget, especially since Justin in there is pointing at his watch as we speak. So anyway, let me start first by talking a little bit about James Buchanan Duke, which is the father of the heiress. And he was born in 1854. He really was an incredible businessman. He's somebody who was born, his father was widowed very early, so he and his brothers grew up poor on a farm. And where was that farm?
It was in New Jersey.
The Midwest.
It was in
the Northeast?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, he grew up in this environment where he worked by his hands. Education was not a premium in their household. He did get a business college degree, but he wasn't somebody who had the luxury of pursuing higher education to the extent that he would have liked to. But he was a very shrewd businessman. So tobacco at the time existed pretty much by way of people having factories, like when we think of Panama today, many of us think of these hand-rolled cigars and whatnot. Well, cigarettes were very primitively assembled. So he and his father, they grew tobacco on the farm. Now remember, this is in the aftermath of the Civil War, so there's poverty everywhere, lots of devastation. But they owned enough land where they could grow tobacco, and they were in the field working it. So they decided to acquire a facility in Durham, North Carolina, in order to be able to produce these cigarettes directly and not just sell to another company that would assemble them. And he went immediately to machinery. So he was one of the first in the industry to start using machinery to assemble cigarettes. And it allowed you to be far more efficient, to have a price much lower than others. And immediately he started buying up the produce of other growers so he can run them through his factory. And over time, he did two things that was very radical. One was the mechanization, in which he decided that this can be done much better than it's been done historically. Another was the fact that he thought a lot about how to assemble production from a large swath of the entire industry through facilities that he either owned or he was affiliated with. So he ended up forming this, what became called a trust at the time, but it's not a trust in the way we use it. It's a combine. They used that phrase back then. Today, we'd probably use the word monopoly, sort of. I mean, at one point, they assembled 90% of all the production in America. Imagine that. Cigarettes in the late 19th century, 90% of the industry was coming through the group of growers that he assembled.
Strong roots are essential for a healthy tree, especially your family tree. That's why you work hard to take care of your family every day. At TuckerAllen, we know that taking care of your family means planning for the future. Our team provides personalized estate planning to help you protect your family, your legacy, and your future. From wills and trusts to long-term care and estate planning, count on TuckerAllen, personalized estate planning made simple.
So they had all the hard, sharp-elbowed tactics of pushing competition out. So they were really good at that. They drove them out one way or another, kind of like John D. Rockefeller was doing around the same time in the oil industry. So he managed to assemble a lot of wealth this way. I should add that there's one other thing that was hugely influential, and that was the fact that he did marketing. He understood that, look, if we create loyalty for a particular brand, that means people will choose us, and they'll prefer us, and they'll even pay more for us. That was a radical idea at the time because nobody advertised tobacco. They thought tobacco's tobacco. And instead, he created a brand. And at first, other competitors were thinking this was silly, a waste of money. He did things associated with pretty women in these ads and strong, muscular guys, all those things that we associate with advertising later in the 20th century with cigarettes. But he was the first that really did that and created such a reputation that people wanted a Duke product. So after he virtually conquered the field, 90% of the distribution in America, he did the same thing in the UK. He formed a similar group of investors in which they control the market. So needless to say, this couldn't go on forever. And many of you are familiar with what was called the antitrust legislation. They call it trust busting. And remember, the word trust at the time was used to refer to a monopoly. So they came up with this idea through Roosevelt that they were going to create legislation to break all these companies up, which they did. They broke up most notoriously was John D. Rockefeller, but also the tobacco industry was broken up, and Duke's. Thereafter, Duke chose to go into, or in addition, went into the area of hydroelectric power, built these dams, and decided that this was critical to the area of the Southeast, that textiles would be huge, and they need electrification. And in order to have that, you need a source of it. And he decided that building dams was the most efficient way to provide all the electricity that would be needed for industry in the Southeast. Again, this was still recovering from the devastation that occurred in the Civil War. So he came to dominate that industry, and Duke Power exists to this day and is still very powerful. So he is this great businessman. He has one child, and though he married a woman that had a child from previous marriage, but he ends up with one child before he dies, and this child was born in 1912. Do you want to kind of pick up from there?
Yeah. So his child, Doris Duke, was the only girl in her family, and she was super loved by her father. He absolutely adored her. He named his yacht after her. He named his car after her. He made sure that their home was the biggest home. I believe it was on Fifth Avenue, was built, before she was born so that she could be born at home. But
he really wanted to get that done before her birth.
He really did, yeah. But he adored Doris, and whenever he died, he left her a lot of his fortune, a big portion of it. And so she came into it at ages 20, 25, and 30.
That was the ages when she was allowed to draw out some money.
That's correct.
And how old was she when he died?
She was 12.
Boy, that must have been dead, because she worshipped him, apparently.
She did. She adored him. She wrote him little love letters, and he just would go over them again and again. And I mean, her mom had another son outside of the marriage.
Before they were married.
Yeah, and the mom liked, that son's name was Walker, and her mom liked Walker more than her. So it was kind of just, her and her dad against the world.
Her mother may have felt that a little bit because her dad clearly was obsessed with his daughter.
Yes, and even...
Or her husband, excuse me.
Even at the age of 14, she sued her mom because her mom was trying to sell the farms that her dad had, and she didn't want her mom to sell them, and she successfully actually sued her and kept those farms, which she turned into Duke Farms, which is a big, huge, greenery, greenhouse, eco-friendly, everything. They just grow all kinds of things. They do all kinds of agriculture things there. It really they make a huge difference there. But she held on to that at the age of 14, and she wasn't letting it go.
And they had several major properties that she held on pretty much the rest of her life, or close to it.
Yeah, they had
Talk about those.
They had the farms. They had a couple of houses in Manhattan, and she held on to those as well.
Or condos.
Yes, and then herself, she had an estate in Hawaii named Shangri-La, and then she had her house on the farms, which she lived between those for most of her life.
So what was called Duke Gardens, that was in Newport?
That's correct, yes, Newport, Rhode Island.
So they had this life where they sort of traveled between Newport, New York City, Hawaii, and there was another place. But these were magnificent homes,
yes,
all of them. And so she pretty much wanted to keep them, I think, and largely out of respect for her dad.
Yeah, I mean, she employed over 200 people to keep the homes running and, moving when she wasn't there and ready for her when she was. But, she didn't even just do that. She did all kinds of other things. She was known for her donations to big organizations. She herself had a charitable foundation that donated all kinds of places. She volunteered on the United Seamen's in, World War II, and she went all across the world just helping people in every single way that she could. In Shangri-La, she brought a whole bunch of Islamic art there, and it's still a museum today featuring a ton of Islamic art. And yeah, she just, like we were talking about, a lot of people just knew her as the rich girl, but she wasn't really just that. She had sides to her, but she really just wanted to help people, especially since she knew that, hey, I have all this money. And she didn't waste it. She used it on her passion projects, but she used it to, make the world a better place and definitely put her name on the map.
Yeah, and she also had a lot of energy and interest. And as you said, she was adventurous, and she traveled the world and went to very unlikely places to find, what was called the world's richest little girl or something at the time. In the 1920s, but she went to Africa. She went to these exotic places where clearly it wasn't perfectly safe, even under the conditions she traveled. But she really had a passion for a lot of different subjects, including let's talk about some of those, like plants.
Plants. She loved dancing. She loved music.
Writing.
Writing. Art was a really big one. And she loved just cultures in general. I think that's why she traveled so much, because when she was there, she wasn't just traveling, she was really just immersing herself into those cultures to really figure out what they were like. And I think a big part of that was she wanted to bring it back to the U.S. because she wanted people to see that, hey, it's not just, this in the world. There's a lot of other things that go into this.
Yeah, and she must have become pretty authoritative on Southeastern Asia art, as well as Islamic art generally.
Yeah, she held a lot of really expensive pieces. She still does today in her museums, but they were anywhere and everywhere. She just adored it.
So what comes across, though, is not somebody who is this rich girl who came into a lot of money early. This is the stereotype.
Yes.
And it's on a lower level, this has happened, time and time again. The reason the stereotype exists is that a child is given a ton of money, and they become a trust fund baby, so to speak, and they never are very productive. Furthermore, they spend everything they have, and it's just a long, tragic, unproductive, sedentary life.
Yeah.
Instead, she actually grew the fortune, right?
Yeah. She, like we were saying, a lot of people just thought of her as the rich girl. They thought she was just wasting all the money, but really close friends, they were like, she didn't come into and when she died, her estate was worth $1.3 billion, but they said she didn't come into $1.3 billion just from her dad. she came into it because she made money and she was very smart with her money. She knew where every single penny was. And I mean, I don't want to say she necessarily worked, but she wrote for the Harper's Bazaar. She became a staff member there. You know, she did jobs. It wasn't just her just wasting away the money.
But you know, I can see, and I'm not critical of the person who dabbles or does a bunch of things briefly, because the rest of us, you know, we find something we kind of like, whatever job it might be, and we like it, but we also need to keep doing it. But if you had all the money in the world and you realize anything you're doing at this particular time, if it's not as exciting to you as it was a month ago, then why keep doing it? Why not go to something that's so that's a problem, I think, with somebody who's really wealthy is continually wanting to be interested in pursuing something that is the most beneficial thing they can do at this moment. And thankfully, I'm not in a position, neither I'm suspecting no one watching this in a position to do that, but those who are, they tend to live lives where they move from one thing to another. Howard Hughes, those of you who've watched that episode, it's a very similar thing.
Yes, they definitely have a lot of passion projects, and I think she was one of the only ones that we kind of see. I mean, Howard Hughes did, but she really fulfilled them. And then I think she kind of moved on to the next thing. I think she just definitely wanted to see an end to them and have them come full circle for her.
And she really was interested in gardening.
Yes.
She studied it. She spent a lot of money having this wonderful garden that became open to the public, Duke Gardens, and that's in Newport area.
That's in Newport, yeah.
So, and she gave a ton of money to the Newport area. I guess we shouldn't leave unmentioned an incident where this curator, a person who apparently she was close to and whose judgment she really valued, because art was, as we've talked, is a big deal to her. So this person was the curator of her, virtually all of her Asian art, and maybe art generally. And he had been with her for a number of years.
6 years.
6 years. So they'd become close. She trusted him. I'm sure she paid him well. But he decided that he was going to go to Hollywood because he had done some work relating to sceneries and sets and whatnot. I don't know how those two come together, but they did for him. So he had this opportunity to go to Hollywood, and I suspect it wasn't about the money. I think she could have matched the money. So they have this blow-up fight. Talk about what you read happened.
Yeah, so I don't think, Doris Duke was the sweet person that everybody kind of thought she was. I think she definitely had, different sides to her. But so he goes in and he turns in his resignation, and there's just a big fight. And this all comes out, years later when the only witness actually came forward. The only witness at the time was the paper boy who was 13. But what the paper boy says is he was down the road and he heard a bunch of screaming and fighting, and then he heard a bunch of screeching, and then a big crash, and then more, car screeching. And so he runs to there, and Doris sees him, and he sees her get out of the car, and she walks around, looks at the car, looks at him, and says, "You need to leave now," and starts yelling at him that he needs to leave. So he runs away. But police get there, and basically what had happened was the car had driven, so there was a gate that they had to stop at. They got in the car together.
Which property was this?
It was at Rocheport, I believe.
Rough Point?
Rough Point, yeah.
And which is the house that was on in Duke Gardens,
yes,
in Newport.
Yes. So they're driving up to the gate, and you have to get out and manually open it. And the curator got out, manually opened it. And later, Doris says that she had gotten into the driver's seat and her foot accidentally slipped. And she had hit him and killed him. But what had happened at the scene was that they had ran through the gate, across the road, and into a tree with his body dragging underneath it. So, I mean, that's a lot for your foot to slip and hit somebody. And in
the midst when you're having an argument.
Yeah, especially when somebody else hears you. And, the only witness never came forward until a very long time later because his father said, "Do not tell anybody, Doris Duke is a woman with a lot of money. Something bad can happen to you." And so I think, honestly, with her telling that lie and maybe paying off a couple of people, she got away with it. If it was murder or if it was an accident, then it was an accident.
And I read this. I don't know. I think this is true. It's from a reliable source that before, when they were looking at prosecuting the case, that she hired the prosecuting attorney to be an attorney with her firm. Mm-hmm. And so that ended his involvement. And then others, she ended up, I don't know if this is in real close proximity to this event. This article suggested it was that what she has ended up giving many millions of dollars to Newport. She's very much loved, I think, in Newport area to build these houses. But there was further giving in the area after this event. And it's kind of like Chappaquiddick. Who's going to expect there to be a proper investigation at Chappaquiddick? It just isn't going to happen. There's too long a history of family and influence. And I think to some extent that's true in Newport with Duke. And she probably was very much liked. She didn't have a reputation of being a bad, intolerable person. We know those people. And generally the word gets around of those people. But she didn't have that reputation. So, but as this incident illustrates, whether she was guilty of manslaughter or not, or murder. I just think that one thing we do know is she had a temper. Mm-hmm. And you're used to having a lot of things your way.
Yeah.
That's forgivable where from the time you were coming to the world, you end up in this situation. I'm not saying it's okay, and it is a moral failing.
But if that's the only thing you know,
but where would any of us be if we had been in that situation?
Yes.
Where we had life experiences where we snap our fingers and things happen.
Yes, yeah. And I think, it kind of goes to show that she was, like you said, very quick to anger, very quick to make decisions from that, as we'll see kind of getting into her will and her last couple of years of her life. That comes up and plays a role again, that she is just quick to anger, quick to cut people out. I just, I read something about her father didn't really trust people, and he really instilled that in her, that you don't really trust anybody. You can, be friends with them. You can love them, but never, ever, let them stab you in the back. Never, ever give them the trust that you think they deserve, because they'll just use it.
Yeah, you're right. Her dad was kind of cynical businessman, like a lot of the guys from that era, and they were all guys, but they tended to be very rough and tumble in terms of their business tactics. Mm-hmm. So this incident we just described, she was in her 50s, mid-50s or so when this happened. We should probably mention there were 2 marriages.
Yeah.
Say something about that.
So she was married to James Cromwell in 1935. They did okay. They went on a whole 2-year-long honeymoon, and they traveled the whole entire world. That's when she kind of got moved into Hawaii. And after that, they got home, and he asked her, okay, what is my monthly salary from you going to be? And I don't really know what her response was to that. I'm sure she just laughed, because I would have. But he also expected her to pay for his campaign. He was running for the Senate, I believe. And instead, what happened was she ruined his campaign by saying bad things about Eleanor Roosevelt, and then going and hiring PIs to look into his extramarital affairs. So that kind of all came down, and, she had extramarital affairs too, so it's kind of, 2 sides. But basically that made the marriage just end at that point, and they divorced in 1945. It actually took 5 years for them to divorce, because he was trying to go after $10 million of her money, and she was only 24 at this time, so she was just coming into the next $10 million that she was going to get. And he wanted that. And so she fought him long and hard for 5 years, and eventually he gave in, and he only got a little bit of it. And then she went on to marry again. She married again in 1947, but it wasn't really relevant because it was a very quick marriage. But they were married for a year and then divorced after. They were still really amicable. She paid for a lot of his stuff, and she still really cared about him. And that kind of goes to show that, she definitely, like we said, she has 2 sides. She really cares about the people she cares about, and she makes sure that they're well taken care of. And then I should mention that with James Cromwell, she also had a miscarriage. people aren't sure if it was his baby. She later on said it wasn't, and it was just some stranger that she met on a train.
That's
she
not
said
very flattering.
She said there was nothing else to do on the train. So, so she went and she had a miscarriage, and that really stuck with her throughout the years. She said at first she didn't even know if she wanted it, but then after about the 3-month mark, that was when she lost it. But she also felt, motherhood, and that really stuck with her, and she eventually went on to actually adopt a woman named Chandy, and we'll get more into her, but Chandy was 35 when she adopted her, and Doris was around 72, I believe, and she said that when she met Chandy, she thought it was her, the daughter that she miscarried reincarnated.
Yeah, and this requires a little bit of a setup. A couple points I'd make is that this is not somebody who, because they could, married 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Mm-hmm. You see that a lot among heiresses or heirs. Instead, she gives it 2 attempts. And she did, in her defense regarding her first marriage, she did help the guy get elected to some local office.
Yeah.
And so she was supportive early on, but she wasn't a faithful wife, and he wasn't a faithful husband in the way that I think we all would want to see. Mm-hmm. So the other thing, though, is that she, during this period of time, she did feel free. She was somewhat of a liberated person, quote unquote.
Yes.
Meaning that she didn't live necessarily by the credos of our culture generally, but of her class, she probably did. Mm-hmm. I think that was acceptable behavior to this class, sadly, but I think it's true. And another thing that will help make sense of what we're about to talk about is, among the many interests that she had an interest in Eastern mysticism, right?
Yes, yeah, in Indian mysticism.
Yeah, and so she had the ability to go and explore things in Asia and in India in particular, and she developed, some interest in some of these, I would call them New Age sorts of religions or beliefs. And I think that made her vulnerable whenever she met this person that she thought, for some reason, the right age and all matching up.
Yeah.
She thought that she was the reincarnated?
Yeah, reincarnated daughter.
Okay, so you were about to say she was in her 60s when this happened, when she came across.
She was around 72 when this happened.
72, in the 60s.
Yeah. It was in 1940. She had the miscarriage, and then
so in the 70s.
Yeah, at the age of 73, she met Chandy Hefner.
Okay. All right. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so she met Chandy, and she just thought, oh my gosh, you're my daughter. And I guess Chandy just kind of went along with it. I don't really know what you say.
How did they meet? Do we know?
No, I think they just met through mutual friends. Chandy's sister was married to somebody really big. I can't remember.
In the art world or entertainment?
It was in entertainment. I can't remember exactly what industry it was. But basically, Chandy's sister was in money, and I guess they, brought Chandy around with them, and that's how Doris eventually met her. And she just adored her. She took her under her wing for about, 2 years, gave her everything. She moved her into Shangri-La in Hawaii, where Chandy actually stayed and lived. And she just gave her everything. She promised her, all of this money is going to be yours after I pass. She wrote a will even saying that.
So she revised her will.
Yeah, so she wrote a will with Chandy in it. The executor was still Dr. Harry Demopoulos, which was one of her first executors, but she carried that on down. And she gave a lot to the foundation, and then she gave a lot to Chandy, and she just kind of split it. But, she wanted Chandy taken care of, and they were good. They were really good to go until Chandy introduced her to Bernard Lafferty. And
without getting into details, this Lafferty comes from a kind of a very questionable background,
yes.
A checkered past. He had done a variety of things and was unemployed at the time, apparently had a drinking problem.
Yeah, and he never went to any formal school. He couldn't read fully. So, I think he was just a butler who...
He was hired as that.
Yes, who kind of, made his rounds from rich family to rich family, because Chandy, what happened was it was actually her sister's butler. They fired him, and they gave Chandy a call and said, hey, we've got this butler out on the streets of New York City. We know you're in New York right now, because they were staying at Doris's summer home. And they were like, can you help him out? So Chandy was like, okay, that's fine. They took him in, hired him on. They dealt with the drinking problem because that, emerged again. But then he got very, very close to Doris. And Lafferty was kind of a character. People were like, I remember him serving us drinks in his full butler's attire with no shoes on and bare feet. And he had a ponytail. He wore gold earrings. Just all kinds of, he was just out there for a butler of that rich of a person. It's just a bit strange.
Kind of bohemian, but it's funny that sounds like that's the sort of person that would appeal.
That would fit her.
Because she wasn't real zipped up.
No. But he took care of her, and they became really, really close, and he kind of pushed Chandy out the door.
Yeah, oddly enough, that was surprising to me, is that Chandy had, of course, as you said, introduced, had gotten him this job, but apparently he didn't have a close relationship with her, thankfully, because then it would have been, kind of a conspiracy of sorts. And he's the one who told Doris later that he thought that perhaps Chandy and her boyfriend at that time, who were living, as you said, at Shangri-La, the estate in Hawaii, were engaged in a campaign to enrich themselves through her, which doesn't take, you wouldn't have to be conspiracy-minded to conclude that could very well be true.
Yeah, she felt like she came down with a mysterious illness in 1990 when she was at the home in Hawaii, where obviously Chandy and her boyfriend lived. And Chandy's boyfriend, James, he was one of her bodyguards, Doris's bodyguards as well. But basically, she came down with this illness, and Lafferty went on and on about how they were trying to poison her and they were trying to kill her for her money. And I think she was kind of developing dementia at this time. She gets really ill in the end and passes. And I think that's kind of part of what had happened.
Yeah, the early stages.
Yeah, and part of what had happened with this, along with just how she was raised in the background of don't trust anybody. I think that really just resonated with her in this, and she didn't want anything to do with Doris. She eventually told Doris, I don't want anything to do with you. I'm writing you out of this will. I don't feel safe around you.
She told Chandy.
Oh, yes, excuse me. She told Chandy that she didn't want anything to do with her anymore. She regretted adopting her.
And this is occurring in the 80s,
In
right?
the 90s.
Oh, so
yes.
She dies in 93.
Yeah, so she dies in 93. And basically it went on for about 2 years, and then Chandy went and sued her because she said that Doris was going to take care of me the rest of my life. She said this, this, and this. And a week after Chandy sued Doris, she actually passed away. So there was just a lot of turmoil in those
Doris passed away.
Yes. So there was just a lot of turmoil in those 2 years, between Chandy and Doris, and then it just led right up to her passing.
So apparently Chandy was somewhat okay through the decade of the 1980s in terms of their relationship. We'll assume it wasn't always great, but it really took this sharp turn around 1990, you're thinking.
Yeah, and Chandy, I was reading an article that she, was talking about everything that happened in it, and she said that she started noticing Lafferty leading up to the early 90s. He was wearing, more gold jewelry. He had on nice watches. He was getting more in with Doris, because I don't believe Chandy and Doris spent, every single waking second together. Chandy spent a lot of time at that home in Hawaii. So
they were apart.
Yeah, so they were apart. And obviously Lafferty was with Doris 24/7. He's her butler.
And personal assistant.
Yes. And so I think it just kind of all went downhill with it, and he started planting little seeds of doubt in Doris over the years, because he was her butler for about 6 years before all of this started happening.
Yeah, so it's hard to get a good hold on what you think Bernard Lafferty was. He apparently was pretty faithful for many years, so he was with her quite a while. Mm-hmm. Do we know what year he actually came on?
I believe it was...
Was it in the early 80s, or was it later? So anyway, it's interesting to explore their relationship, which it's easy to demonize Lafferty, and perhaps with justification. Mm-hmm. But he was there for a good while. There's no clear evidence of any sort of fraud or stolen money that I came across.
No, nothing of that. I mean, he was pretty straight and narrow. It wasn't until her passing that...
He kind of went wild.
Yes. Yeah, he went very wild.
So we're going to try to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so, so that we're not too badly over schedule. So then let's talk about that. She passes away. There are a number of lawsuits. There is a trust in place, and that trust had most of the money. I mean, the bulk of her estate was controlled by this trust that she had created. Mm-hmm. So to be on the board of the trust was an important role, or to be an executor of the will was an important role. So, and the provision of the trust said that the executor of the will would sit on the board with there was some major bank trustee at the time.
It was U.S. Trust Company.
U.S. Trust Company. So there was a powerful corporate participant, but also this person, whoever's going to be executor. Well, Lafferty was named because that was the last will. Mm-hmm. Now, in Duke's defense, there hadn't been multiple wills over the years, but there had been several. There had been 3 that we know of. Mm-hmm. The original will was the one that this Dr. Demopoulos, who I think this was in the 50s or so, 1950s, but had been around a long time. And he was a trusted doctor of the family, and he had agreed to be a trustee of this trust. He had been present at the creation of her will. It was a will in which much of her money at that time even was transferred into this trust. Now remember, there's still a trust in existence that her father created. What James Buchanan Duke provided for Doris was not entirely distributed to her. It was largely, but not entirely. He did something that we don't normally recommend for estate planning, because more often than not it goes wrong, badly wrong. We've talked about a lot of cases of that. But in this case, this is the exception to the rule, where we don't know exactly how much money she was given that was outside the trust to use as she chose. But we know that she had access to a lot of money after these 3 stages where it was released. There was a portion that was released at age 25, or 21, 25, and I think 31 or 30. Mm-hmm. So that's good, meaning it at least wasn't at one time. So we're a big fan of giving a fortune or giving some amount of money. Doesn't have to be a fortune. Giving some amount of money in a series of stages. But even better than that is to go ahead and keep the trust in place, and to have a trustee that you trust, coupled with an institution, and there was an institution involved in that trust, to make funds available. But in this case, I think maybe James Buchanan knew his daughter. James Buchanan Duke knew his daughter, even though she was only 12 at the time he passed. But anyway, he made the decision that she did have access. And here's the thing about it. She listened to experts. She managed the money in such a way to where the fortune was increased. Even adjusting for inflation, it was significantly increased. I saw an estimate of the estate at $5.3 billion. I only saw that one place, but it was a good source. And it may have been a New York Times article.
Yeah, I know that she grew just in her life from $100 million that her father gave her to that $1.3 billion.
Yeah, just that portion of it.
Yes.
So this was a case where there was a lot of risk, and she turned out to be, whatever her faults, and she had many, like most of us, but but she did manage the money well, and she listened to experts, and she made good decisions. She had to approve, the investment strategies. Though I'm confident she didn't manage all those directly, but I do think that she was aware of what the decisions were, and she approved them, and maybe presumably disapproved some. So this is a case where she, from a money side, things went well, and I think that original will and trust were probably the most thoughtful ones. What came later, the one after Shondi comes on board, and then the one where Lafferty's on board, those were probably when her judgment was starting to deteriorate.
Yeah, I think the one with Shondi, when she came on board, I think that one was more okay because she still had Dr. Dimopoulos as the executor. It was just a lot going to Shondi. But once Lafferty came on board, it all went downhill. And especially after her death, he spent all kinds of money. So. Yeah,
he did. And we'll get to that real briefly. But so when she did, we can talk about, we just talked more about her dad's estate planning, but her estate planning was really very good. She had the bulk of her fortune going to a trust. Even though she took care of people that she cared about, the bulk of it went to the charitable trust that she had already created. But the thing is, they're always, whenever you have trusts, almost without exception, there are assets that are outside the trust for various reasons, most of which you just choose to have them outside the trust. So in her case, of course, there were assets outside the trust. And those assets went into the estate, and many of those were to be sold and then placed into her charitable trust. But whoever's in the position of being executor of her estate, as we've told you many times, whether you're rich or poor, if you die and you have money, and there's an estate opened, if you have more than $50,000 in the state of Missouri, I think that's still the statutory threshold, then you're going to have an estate, and that means that somebody gets paid a significant amount of money based on a percentage of your assets, and you can imagine the amount of money that's going to be generated if you're the executor or one of the executors for Doris Duke's estate. So many of her assets were in her trust at her death, so they didn't go into the estate. They were in the charitable trust. But the money that went into the court, and as a result went through the entire probate process, those assets were kind of the subject of some disputes. You had the lawsuit by Shondi. You have a dispute. Dr. Dimopoulos, who's still around at the time that she passes away, doesn't like this Lafferty character at all, and he sees that he's living pretty generously in this role as executor and sitting on the board of the charitable trust. So you get paid for that too. So what was he flying around her jet?
He was he spent $1 million on himself. He spent I have it right here. He had made a payment of $155,000 to multiple luxury stores, just all kinds of things. He got a plane. He traveled everywhere. Just weird.
And he was in her 737 jet, going places.
Yeah,
a 737 jet is what you would board to fly from St. Louis to L.A.
And this one I found weird. He remodeled her bedroom and used $60,000 to do so that he could stay in it instead of just staying in another bedroom in the 30-bedroom mansion. I'm not sure about that one.
So, I mean, some of this you can say is malevolent. Others you can say it's what a hippie would do who's put in a role like this, some bohemian guy who doesn't necessarily mean he was guilty of defrauding her or maltreating her. We don't have evidence of that. There are allegations made, but I'm skeptical. But I do think, you put a guy like that in charge of money, and that's the way he's going to behave. Yeah. So fortunately, the court, I think that he realized this was not going to go his way. There was a settlement reached, because it is difficult where, remember, the threshold of competency to make a will to do your estate planning is very, very low. And in order for you to overcome that, you have to show undue influence, fraud, coercion. And it's hard to do that where somebody's had a relationship for a long time. Now, granted, if they have them in their exclusive control under circumstances where they can wield that influence, and if they play a role, there's evidence they played a role in facilitating their appointment, et cetera, then yeah, you can prove it. So don't get me wrong, and it does happen. But it's just not easy. So this is the guy that Doris Duke had trusted and continued to trust. And so now this doctor, and others around him, not just him, but others who knew her and cared about her estate, they were involved. So a deal struck, and that's what often happens. A deal struck. So I don't know the exact terms of the deal. So much of this we don't know. Remember, we only know what's in probate. Mm-hmm. We don't know what's going on in the trust. Those can all be private, just like we can't tell you the details of what was distributed from the trust at the time that she turned age 30, for example, from her dad's trust. But in this case, so it said, he was paid $10 million, and he was given a guaranteed salary of like $500,000 a year for life, for the balance of his life. I want to qualify these things we say on the show because, we weren't the lawyers involved in the case. But the best evidence we can find are that these numbers are accurate. Mm-hmm. So what else can you do? I mean, you can take a stand on principle and say, we're not going to pay this guy anything, but you go to trial and you risk losing. And not to mention, tens of millions of dollars were spent in attorney fees. All of that was paid from the estate. It wasn't paid by the people who were fighting from their personal assets. It was paid for from the estate. Mm-hmm. And that's because there was a colorable claim. If there's a colorable claim, then the argument goes that, look, why shouldn't the estate pay if somebody who has a genuine dispute, wants to pursue something that may be just and right for everybody? Why should they be discouraged from that because they would have to pay for it out of their own savings? So the theory goes that if your claim is colorable and legitimate, good faith, then there's a good chance that you're going to the trust will pay for it. Not always. The court doesn't have to do that. So in this case, the happy part, summing up here, the happy part is that I think she had a happy life. I mean, this isn't a sad, depressed, rich little girl.
No, I just think you need to be careful about, who you pick as executors, especially when you get older and people are influencing you and everything like that.
That's when you become really vulnerable.
Yes, yeah. And I know that, all of that money did pass on to the two twins of her half-brother, Georgia and Walker.
Some money. We don't know
how. Some of the money. Georgia and Walker the third. But they're in a lot of litigation right now, too. So.
And which is, we actually are going to do a follow-up to this that we think you'll find very interesting. This is a story you probably don't know much about, and these are the nephews of Doris Duke, mm-hmm. of her the children of her half-brother.
Yes.
And it's a very interesting story, full of twists and turns, yes. And involving not the same fortune, but a fortune, mm-hmm. and very interesting. But I hope this has been helpful to you. We like to set the context of her life so it makes sense when we talk about the estate planning. In this case, from a estate planning standpoint, things turned out well. I think James would have been happy with that.
Yeah.
He probably would have liked for his daughter to have married and had a family and descendants and progeny and all that. But I think I'm confident he would have been pleased with her performance in terms of managing money.
Yeah, and I'm sure that he set all that up so she could have a good life like the one that she did, and she used it the right way.
Yeah, and she protected the fortune when she went out of this world.
Yes.
Subject to the decisions we just talked about not picking well executors and people who are trustees, huge issue. But apart from the probably deterioration at the end. She managed to go out of the world with a plan in place that mm-hmm. really protected the overwhelming bulk of her estate was protected. So, anyway, with that, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. I apologize. My estimates of time are always wrong. We will work on making these shorter. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by TuckerAllen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit TuckerAllen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.